The Transpacific Experiment, how China and California collaborate and compete for our future. You've already got a good amount of background from Clay, so I'll kind of jump right into it. There we go. So talk today is going to come in basically 4 sections. First, I'm going to give you basically a working definition of, what is the Transpacific Experiment? What am I even talking about here? And then I think with all books, we tend to think that they kind of, they come straight from the abstract ideas of the author, but really they come out of our lived experiences. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what Clay mentioned about my own sort of journey into this and how that informs some of the work. And then we're going to focus in especially on the China-Hollywood story. I think that this is easily one of the most interesting and important, but definitely the most fun part of the China-California relationship today. If you really dig into it, it's just a fascinating smash of cultures, a tug of war over money and soft power and control, and then just a lot of movies, some good, many bad. So we're going to dive into that. And in the last section, I'm just going to try to zoom out a little bit and draw some broader connections between the China-Hollywood story and also the China-Silicon Valley story. I think there's a lot of parallels between these two industries and the way that they interact with China, specifically in how China approaches them, what it hopes to sort of get out of them or learn from them, and how it hopes to foster its own innovative or creative cultural industries. So that's kind of the roadmap we're going to follow today. First, what is the Trans-Pacific Experiment? I call it the largest experiment ever run in grassroots superpower diplomacy. So sort of breaking that down, I think the key word here is grassroots and diplomacy. Superpowers, we know we're talking about the US and China, but my argument is that California in the last 10 years has really been where the relationship comes down to the level of people, ordinary people, investors, filmmakers, technologists. This here in California is the fluid ecosystem of students coming to places like USC or Stanford, home buyers, technologists, Chinese venture capitalists showing up in Silicon Valley, or Silicon Valley technologists going to China, filmmakers showing up here, and people like Matt Damon going over to China. It's this ecosystem that we've built that connects the two countries, or specifically this state and China, in many different diverse ways. And whereas for many decades, the US-China relationship was really something that happened at this very high level. It was presidents talking to presidents, or major American companies exporting their manufacturing to China, but it was very high level and it was very distant. Kind of we send them goods, they send us, or we send them money, they send us goods. We ally with them to balance the Soviet Union in some way. And what I have sort of seen and experienced and lived in the last 10 years is that it's now a much different relationship. It's much deeper, it's much more here at the ground level, and it brings kind of deep interdependency and engagement. And California is the living laboratory for this because it's the top destination for students, for home buyers, for investors, technologists, filmmakers. It really is at the front lines of all these. And that makes it this laboratory for what happens when you mix these two countries and cultures together. I think the first instinct of a lot of people, including me as I was kind of getting into this, is to think, wow, look at all these new possibilities. Look at the cultural fusions that are going to happen, or the way that, say, Chinese venture capital can end up stimulating some new startups in Silicon Valley, or Chinese students coming over here in many ways sort of filled major budget gaps that emerged after the financial crisis. So you have this potential for some synergy and for some kind of win-win stuff. But what I've discovered over the course of following this for 7, 8 years now is that when you bring international relations down to the grassroots level, you bring it face to face, it also leads to a lot of new tensions. Meeting each other, getting up close and personal doesn't always make things smoother over time. And in all of the industries that I follow in the book, you see that. You see this balance of new possibilities opening up, but also a lot of kind of nitty-gritty tensions between the two places and the people. So, a reminder, books come from normal people. I'm a normal person. And the stories that are in the books, the stories they tell, the ideas, it all comes very much out of lived experience. And for me, that's been especially true with this book. It's just stuff that I kind of stumbled into, and my relationships with the people in the book, with the stories, it all went into the quote-unquote analysis that goes there. So I just wanted to share a little bit of my own Trans-Pacific story. Clay gave a preview of it before, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. I grew up in Palo Alto, right next to Stanford. All through middle school, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, I basically had nothing to do with China. I didn't think twice about China during the whole time. They didn't offer Chinese at my school at the time in high school, and if they'd offered it, I definitely would not have taken it. It was basically by almost random chance that in the summer of 2008, I got a summer job that plopped me down in Beijing. This was when I was halfway through college, between my sophomore and my junior year. So I was sort of like a glorified camp counselor in Beijing for high schoolers. And from the moment that I touched down, I was just blown away. I was totally fascinated. I thought of myself as relatively well-traveled because I'd been to Europe to visit my family and stuff, but I'd never been anywhere that was just so utterly different at the ground level, different in the way it looks, different in the way the life on the street feels, different in the conversations that I was having with people. And so I was kind of instantly hooked. This was in the few weeks leading up to the Olympics, so also like a very heady time in a lot of ways. And I traveled around. I went to Sheehan, I went to Shanghai, and I decided right then that after I graduated college, I'd be coming back to China. So when I graduated, I moved back to Sheehan in central China, where the terracotta warriors are. And I worked as an English teacher for a year, but I just spent a couple of years just trying to devour every way of understanding the country that I could. So I put a lot of time into the language, a lot of time with my Chinese friends, just trying to sort of see it from their perspective. And eventually it made me want to become a journalist. I felt like the US media was doing a really, really good job of covering the very kind of high-level stuff, corruption at the highest levels of the Communist Party, or dissent and protest and all that, but I felt like it was kind of missing the stories of people like my friends over there, which was, I just felt we didn't have a lot of texture and color in the way that we imagined China. So I set out to try to become a journalist, tried to freelance around the country. I saw a fight, a brawl at an airport, wrote about that, interviewed Chinese students who had come back from the US, and did everything to try to sort of cobble together a resume. But when I basically ran out of money, I hadn't gotten a journalist offer, so I was getting ready to work any old job. I was going to go sell like real estate in Wuhan or something like that. With a whole different fork of my universe. But then a miracle happened, what Clay alluded to. I badly broke my ankle in Beijing. I was playing ultimate frisbee, got knocked around and just tore apart my ankle. But the doctor in the Beijing hospital I went to, he looked at my x-ray for like 2 seconds and said, "Mei shar," like, no problem. And he said, "No, you're good, you're good." So he's like, basically walk it off. So a couple days later I flew home because I had a trip planned. And when I got back to the hospital in Palo Alto, the doctor said, "Yo, shar, like it's bad." So I'd broken my ankle in a bunch of different places, and I wasn't allowed to fly for 2 months. I shouldn't have flown home in the first place, and I couldn't go back to China. So I felt kind of stuck. I was back home, and I thought, I'm going to kind of lose all these threads of China that I've been following. I was following a lot of what's going on with Chinese millennials, with the Chinese middle class, the language. I'd spent so long trying to get a handle on that. And I thought that I was going to kind of lose all those threads. But then I discovered that a lot of those threads were coming to me at the time. I was stuck in the Bay Area in Palo Alto, and I started realizing there were tons of Chinese home buyers that were showing up in my hometown. And it was kind of causing a buzz in the town, like, why are so many Chinese people buying homes here? What's it going to do to our real estate prices? What's it going to do to our schools? Blah, blah, blah. So I sort of snuck my way onto one of those bus tours. I talked my way onto one of those and started writing a story about that, about how the sort of rise of the Chinese middle class and insecurity in the Chinese economy was driving this big wave of home purchases over here. So I did a little bit of reporting, and eventually I headed back to China and was very lucky to kind of turn that story into a new job, which in many ways is kind of my dream job, working for the World Post. It was a partnership between the Huffington Post and the Berggruen Institute, a think tank, and they basically said, be our China correspondent, find your own stories, run around, have fun. Well, they didn't say have fun, but I was going to have fun. Once again, I ran into a very unexpected hurdle, visa issues. The Chinese government doesn't love to give out new visas to journalists, and I was kind of caught in the middle of beef between like the New York Times and Bloomberg and the Chinese government. So again, they basically sent me back to Palo Alto and said, wait here for a visa. But this time I had the sense of these stories that were going in both directions. I'd traced them over in China, I'd followed them back home to my hometown, And now I started picking them up all over the place. So I started interviewing like Chinese-born, US-educated tech entrepreneurs, tech engineers who were showing up in Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley folks who were going over to China, and just picking up these threads in a bunch of different industries, investment, technology, film, home buyers, and stuff like that. So eventually I took up my job back in China, sort of did it for a couple of years, and I just realized there was a real knowledge gap. There was a little vacuum of people who were following these stories here in California. I felt like we had a lot of China expertise in Beijing, where you've got a great bunch of journalists and analysts and business people. And you have a different kind of China expertise in Washington, D.C., where you have the kind of policy think tank world. But I feel like California, stuck right in the middle, where so much of the really interesting stuff was happening, there just weren't that many people who were kind of doing China here. So I decided to move back. And that's kind of when I launched on this project and when I first met Clay. So I was doing it in the form of journalism, writing stories, but also just getting involved any way I could. I helped bring some Bay Area mayors over to China to do investment promotion. I was sort of a consultant and an analyst, just any way that I could get involved in these Trans-Pacific storylines. I was hustling to do it. Eventually, all of that writing and work turned into a job at Macropolo, which is the think tank within the Paulson Institute. That started to give me more of the sort of think tank analytical policy perspective and really zooming in on technology. And it sort of all led and contributed into this book. So I just say it has a few different perspectives in it. It's the kind of living over there, meeting people and trying to see China from the ground up, the journalist running around bit, the being back here and tracing them, but then also trying to bring a little bit of analysis as best I can. So that's a long way into the 6 sectors that are covered in the book: education, technology, film and culture, green investment and climate, real estate, and activism politics. And each of these chapters looks to zoom in on the story of one person or one project that I think kind of exemplifies both the possibilities in this and also some of the tensions that emerge. We're very lucky today to have Lily Lee Chun sitting here in the front row. She's actually one of the folks featured in the chapter on politics. She was the first Chinese-American woman to become a mayor in the US, and I found her story super inspiring. So in each of these, try to sort of pick out a person and a storyline and then use them to showcase the broader picture. Today we're going to focus on film and culture, because we're here. We're in LA. I'm trying to really do LA. And I want to first frame this up with a couple of big picture questions, and then take us through sort of the history of the China-Hollywood relationship, in part by watching some clips from movies. We got about 4 cuts from movies that I think exemplify sort of different periods of time in the relationship. And then we'll do that zoom out to say, how did China get here? What's their roadmap for building up a creative or an innovative industry? But the framing questions. This, number 1, is what I would say is the big headline one from especially the Chinese government's perspective. This is about soft power. Soft power is, it's contrasted with hard power. Hard power is military power, economic power. Soft power is the ability to influence people abroad through culture, through their perception of you, through their ideas. And it's something that the US is very, very good at. We've had incredible soft power in the US for a very long time, and in large part thanks to Hollywood. But it's something that the Chinese government has major ambitions for. Doing it abroad is one thing, but at the very least they want to have soft power within their own country. They want Chinese people to watch Chinese movies and be proud of them in a lot of ways. So the big tension that we see playing out over the Hollywood-China story is who gets to claim global culture, who gets to control it, and who gets to profit from it. You kind of have at least 3 dimensions to that. And when you look at how these 2 sides have gotten to know each other, there's always a tug of war over these parts of it. Maybe Hollywood wants to up its profits and China wants to up its control. China wants to have more of a claim to these movies, and Hollywood's willing to sort of allow that in exchange for money. So that's one that we'll kind of trace over the course of this. But number 2, can China create a thriving film industry while maintaining strict censorship controls? This, I think in the present day, this question isn't asked quite as much anymore because of the performance of their film industry. But for a long time, this was front and center. And it's something that also has an analog in the technology space. A lot of people said, can China possibly create a really thriving, innovative technology ecosystem if they don't have a free and open internet, if they don't have freedom of expression? And these were parallel questions that sort of dogged this industry for a long time, and how China has managed to kind of thread the needle and create this while still maintaining its censorship controls is a big part of that story, and it kind of challenges, I think, some of our going ideas about the sources of innovation and the sources of creativity. So I'm going to break down the history of Hollywood and China into three main chunks. All of these, it's way more complex, obviously, and there's tons of stories and subplots and interesting stuff, but I think just for framing purposes, we'll look at it in three phases. So the first one, 1988 to 2008, long period of time, and I call this high hopes and hard realities. This is a period of time when China is it's emerged from the Cultural Revolution, it's opening up its economy, and there's this huge interest and hope that it's going to turn into a great market for US films or a great producer of its own films. But it runs up against a lot of hard realities. I'll go into those in a little bit. 2008 to 2017, I call this kind of the era of co-productions and the era of kitchen sink comedies. That's a term that I'm sure you're not exactly familiar with, but I'll explain that as we go. Co-productions, at the very least, are simple. This is the way that Hollywood and China were kind of forced to work with each other for a long time. It was the way that the Chinese government would essentially force Hollywood studios to include Chinese elements in their film, to include Chinese actors, and it was kind of the great hope. If we can get the Hollywood ecosystem, the Hollywood sort of magic working with the scope of Chinese history and Chinese talent, won't we have these beautiful, cultural synergies in our co-productions? Not exactly turning out as planned. And in the last phase, I put this 2017 to the present day, and going forward is when Chinese blockbusters really arrive. Really big budget, high value blockbusters that we would kind of look at and recognize as blockbusters in our own market, but done from a different perspective. So we're going to go over each of these three phases and use films to illustrate it as we go. So first off, the first phase, 1988-2008, high hopes and hard realities. The person who I followed for a lot of this chapter, who gave me a lot of insight into this, lives here in LA. She's supposed to be out today, but supposed to come to this today, but had some other things. Her name is Janet Yang. She's Chinese American and went very early to work in importing US films into China and importing Chinese films into the US. And as she was doing that, she showed up in China representing some studios and said, hey, we want to import our blockbusters. We want to, open up this market and start making some money. And what she said is the film regulators at the time said, whoa, slow down, American. You need a little bit of a reality check. You need to go to the countryside and see what it's like to watch a movie in rural China. You pay with an egg, you sit on a brick, and you watch the movie on a hanging sheet. So, we do have hundreds of millions of people, and there's potential out there, but this is the reality right now. This is the 1980s. It's a world apart from the China that we know today, and purchasing power, just not all that much. So, I talked to friends, they said their parents, they'd get a couple eggs a month through their, what do you call them, liangpiao, their food rationing tickets, and maybe you'd use one of your eggs to go see Roman Holiday somewhere. But this was where we were starting from the most basic level. Hollywood has a long history of glamour. China has a big potential market, but this is where we're at. In this 80s, this is when you had the two sides really hoping that they'd kind of jump into a beautiful marriage with each other. And part of that marriage was about marrying the movie magic of Hollywood, whatever it is we think that makes Hollywood so special, with kind of the grand sweep and scope of Chinese history. This came to a head in 1988 when these two films both came together, were filmed in China in large part, and were big sort of smash hits back home. Janet Yang, she was working on this movie, Empire of the Sun, is about an American kid, actually Christian Bale. It's a weird movie. It's 88, it's got Christian Bale, Ben Stiller, got these stars, as young kids, basically. Big Hollywood film shot over there. They sort of shut down the whole city of Shanghai to film the dramatic scenes. And at the same time, up in Beijing, they were filming The Last Emperor, which is another sort of very grandiose historical epic about Puyi, the last emperor. And by the time of awards season, these two movies combined for, I think, 17 Academy Award nominations, and The Last Emperor won, I think, like all 9 of its categories or something like this. So the way that Janet Yang described to me, she's like, we saw this infinite potential. Everyone said, wow, China's really opening up, and just imagine what can happen next. Unfortunately, what actually happened next was 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and the whole country and the cultural industry went into retrenchment. The Chinese government very much saw culture as a vector for problems, for American culture kind of coming in and poisoning the minds of the masses in some way. It was personified by a Deng Xiaoping phrase, where all the conservatives were saying, we can't let in American culture if we open up. And he said, if you open the window to get fresh air, there's going to be some flies that come in. You got to deal with it. With the flies, I guess, being Empire of the Sun and The Last Emperor or something like that. So that held for a long time in the 80s, but after Tiananmen, after 1989, there was basically a period of, once again, closing back off. There's a sense it's not worth it. We can't be dealing with these American types. We can't let culture infiltrate our country and lead to, color revolutions that brought down the Soviet Union and all that. So you have a period of time in the 90s where it's a very cool period between the two sides. This is kind of the hard reality I was alluding to. But in this cool period, Hollywood's not doing great over there, and there's strict controls on Chinese films, but you also have a real blossoming of really wonderful art house Chinese films. This is throughout the 80s and the 90s. And there was this early generation of directors that were some of the first to come out of the Cultural Revolution and start making movies about it. Movies about the Cultural Revolution, movies about life in China. So Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, a whole lot more. They sometimes work together with each other, and I think the real kind of crown gem in this period of time is Farewell, My Concubine, wonderful film by Chen Kaige. And it captures while there weren't blockbusters coming out of China, there were really interesting and beautiful films. This won a bunch of awards internationally, and I'm just going to play a clip from it, about a minute and a half or 2 minutes or so.
什么时候洞房花烛夜呀？今儿晚上。好。
还有呢，你呀得当着戏班子老少爷们的面儿，先给我办定亲礼。我得堂堂正正的进你段家的门。
嫌我偷工减料？那成，今儿晚上就是定亲礼，我请各位赏光。
菊仙小姐，你俺哪儿学的戏呀？
哟，我哪儿学过戏呀？
哦，没学过呀，那就别撒狗血了。
莲姨，叫声嫂子吧，不叫不成了。还有今儿晚上证婚人这活儿，你得给我接下来。
黄天霸和妓女的戏不会演，师傅没教过。
这是哪儿按哪儿呢？
师弟，小楼在人前人后提起您来，说的可都是厚的话儿。
别走！
Just a snapshot. So the movies that were going on at the time, there's other great ones. There's The Yellow Earth. This one, a lot of them are really kind of quiet, artistic, deeply thoughtful, and kind of brooding in some ways. You can kind of feel, in some ways, the hangover of the Cultural Revolution and the whole tumult of like the first 30 years of the People's Republic, and they're processing this through movies. So you have really wonderful films coming out of China, but they are not getting seen within China. They're often subject to extreme censorship controls. In this case, for a while they banned this movie, then they let it back in if they cut out some of the parts that had to do with gay romance. And it never got its sort of full due in there. It was doing well at international festivals and stuff like that, but within the Chinese market, a lot of this really great quality stuff just couldn't be shown. And the same restrictions were in place for Hollywood. So 1997 was a year that launched a Studio Blacklist. Basically, Hollywood made 3 movies that got the Chinese government really in a tizzy. Red Corner's about a businessman who's kind of framed by the Chinese government, and the two on the right are about the Dalai Lama, a persona non grata in China. And the Chinese government reacted very badly to the release of these films. They said, you've hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, and these studios are going to be blacklisted from China for a period of time. And so, in many ways, look, we got Brad Pitt, we got Richard Gere. It's like, these are big dudes, and China, which is at the time is a tiny, tiny movie market, really insignificant, saying, you can't make that movie or we're going to blacklist you. One way, Stanley Rosen, a professor here who I learned a lot from, he made this analogy that if you look at the time, China's entire box office at home was smaller than the box office that Hollywood made in Malaysia. Malaysia, tiny little country, small population. Hollywood was making more money in Malaysia at the time than in Hollywood. And it kind of shows what, we thought maybe there would be an imbalance of power here. Hollywood, global industry, but China, despite having very little financial leverage at the time, said, you know what, we're drawing a hard line. Richard Gere, you're not going to work here anymore. Brad Pitt, you're not going to work here, at least for a very long time. I think he's back. Yeah, he's back.
Yeah, Brad Pitt has over 1 million followers on Weibo.
Brad's doing great. All well-deserved. So I think about this kind of frames up where we're going with the next phase. Because Hollywood and China, at the time, Hollywood took the blacklist very seriously. They very much kind of took it to heart. And I think that was because even though Hollywood and China were worlds apart on issues of censorship, on questions about the Dalai Lama, culture, creativity, the one thing that the two sides did agree on was that the Chinese box office was going to be really, really big one day. And this is 1997, just before things start to take off. This is the Chinese box office booming over a period of, I guess this is about 15 years here. Looking back at 2004, 2003, it's almost non-existent. There is money being made, but not enough to really fund a domestic industry, and not enough to have Hollywood fully catering its movies to them at the time. But over this period of time, you've got basically 40% year-on-year growth for many of these for this period in time over here. At first, it's huge growth, 40%, but it's not yet huge on the balance sheet, but then it starts every year, you just have a major leap up until the point where it's now approaching, it's quite close to the North American box office. And one of the sort of interesting things of this period, this is tied to the rise of the Chinese middle class. But it's not like suddenly China got much better at making movies, or it's not like suddenly the censorship controls went down and creative films were allowed to flourish or anything like that. It had a much more kind of tangible physical reason. There was greater purchasing power, and there was a huge expansion in just the number of movie theaters and the number of movie screens at the time. As of 2009-10, you could have major cities in China with over 1 million people that didn't have a single movie theater in them, like the city of San Jose or whatever, some section of LA. Huge populations with no movie theaters. So just the simple act of putting bricks together, putting up a screen and making people not pay with an egg anymore, but giving them a place to watch movies was a huge part of fueling this boom. The middle class was finally getting money to spend on them, and people were fueling a major rise in the box office. This is where we enter the period of time that I call the co-productions and the kitchen sink comedies. So we'll start with the co-productions, and I'll go into the homegrown Chinese films in a little bit. So this is where sort of Hollywood's long-term bet on the Chinese market starts to look like it's going to pay off. They took it to heart with the censorship controls. They, took the lesson of the studio ban. Finally, China has the leverage, it has the box office, and Hollywood's ready to kind of do business. But China, the government, and even the filmmakers over there, they don't want to have their industry just completely bulldozed, steamrolled by Hollywood films. They don't want suddenly, every weekend you have a Marvel movie, a Disney movie, and are those the same company now? I can't remember. Point being, if you're the Chinese government and you're concerned about soft power, especially at home, you don't want your own citizens spending every weekend going to look at the glamorous lives of people in America, or you don't want to send them out there to go watch America Save the World every weekend. And so the strategy the Chinese government took was to impose very strict controls on the number of Hollywood films that could get into China, but then offer a workaround. So they'd allow 20, initially it was 22 foreign films to be imported into China on a revenue sharing basis. But they said you can be outside of this quota. You can be counted as a domestic film if you do what's called a co-production. Basically means you have to work with a Chinese partner. You need to bring Chinese storylines into it. You need to bring Chinese actors into it. And this forced the two sides into this kind of very awkward relationship. It forced Hollywood to say, okay, like, we're going to start bringing Chinese actors into our movies. We're going to take on Chinese money. And it forced Chinese film production companies to find ways to kind of insert themselves into Hollywood films that really had nothing to do with them in many ways. So on the left here, this is Iron Man 3. Iron Man, pretty like raw American movie about an American guy going out and whatever, saving the world with his super suit. But when they were releasing it in China, in an attempt to get themselves qualified as a co-production, they inserted a totally random Chinese scene. Iron Man is injured, he's hurt, and a Chinese doctor and his beautiful nurse assistant are the only ones in the world who can save him. So you have Fan Bingbing, supermodel actress, and a respected Chinese actor, this guy on the right, sort of just in the middle of the movie randomly kind of coming in suddenly, like saying, oh man, the whole world counts on us doing this surgery. Oh yes, we must do it. Go fix him. 3 minutes later, they're out of there. They never show up again. And so you had these really awkward kind of forced things. And they showed that scene in China, but they actually cut it out when they showed it in the US. And it led to this huge kind of groan from Chinese audiences and from American audiences. The Chinese audiences, I think, the goal of this co-production model is to kind of instill pride. They want to see Chinese doctors saving Iron Man, and we're going to feel great about our country. But it did not feel like that if you were watching the movie. It felt like the situation where, somebody, your friends or the guys on the street won't let you play with them, and your mom comes out and says, you have to let, Johnny play with you, and you kind of shamefacedly go over there and you participate, but it's just embarrassing. And that was kind of the way that co-productions played out. There were a lot of these type of Iron Man-esque sort of random insertions. They were always saying, what if we get a really organic story? What if we, organically bring American and Chinese actors into a totally new story? That was what they tried with The Great Wall, with Matt Damon. And this was for many years. It was anticipated for 3-4 years beforehand, and it was kind of the great hope of co-production. We're bringing the #1 American star. We're bringing the biggest Chinese landmark of all time. It's directed by Zhang Yimou, super respected former art house director. The movie was awful, and it flopped. It was really bad. I went to see it. It came out in early 2017. Not that long after I had moved back from China, and I was I was ready. I was like, yeah, China, American co-productions, let's do this. Let's bring these cultures together. Opening night, midnight showing in Oakland. I'm there with my popcorn. There's nobody in the movie theater except for me, and the movie is just brutal. It's so awkward. It's, they have the Chinese actors and actresses who can't really speak English, forced to deliver their lines in English, and it just hurts your ear a little bit. And the story is ridiculous on all fronts. So this was kind of a real phase, a real wave of the relationship where we thought we could just kind of bring these two sides together, force them together in some ways, and some kind of wonderful synergy would happen. But it just ended up being a very awkward marriage. So during the same period of time, or I guess this kind of gives some context, bring it back to Janet Yang, the woman I alluded to earlier. She's been involved in a co-production or two and has been an observer of this for a long time and describing why it was so awkward when the two sides got together. There's a lot of mutual projection. China has a Hollywood dream, Hollywood has a China dream. China wants respect. They want their content to be seen. And Hollywood's China dream, very simple, cash. This fundamental kind of misalignment of goals, the two sides working at cross purposes, and also the two sides both thinking that they have the real power, that they're the ones who should be listening to. I spoke to a woman who actually attended USC Film School, a Chinese woman, attended USC Film School, is a producer in Beijing, and she's worked on co-productions. And I asked her, what's it like between the two sides? Do they kind of get along, or who has the real power in the relationship? She said the problem is both sides think they have the power. The Chinese side says, hey, we're China, we got this huge market, like you gotta listen to us. And the Hollywood side is like, hey, we're Hollywood, we're raw glamour, like you gotta listen to us, we know how to make movies. And they're just constantly kind of talking past each other in different ways. So this period of co-productions was very awkward, not very fun to watch, not great movies, period. But in the background, China's own film industry is developing at the same time. And it's the rise of what I call the kitchen sink comedies. For a while, the biggest movies in China had always been foreign imports. I think as of 2012, the biggest movies ever in China were Avatar, Titanic, and like Transformers 2, Age of whatever. And you really had this sense that Hollywood movies were going to kind of continue to dominate there, but you had a very, an underdog story in some ways of these very weird Chinese comedies suddenly coming onto the scene. And starting in 2012, you had a run of Chinese domestic comedies that took the #1 spot in the box office each year. They beat out movies like Transformers, they beat out The Fast and the Furious. They started to get traction. And I call them the kitchen sink comedies because it's just kind of it's an era where they just throw everything into the movie. It's got violence, it's got sexual jokes, it's got like fart jokes, it's got CGI, it's history, it's just all smashed together. And to my eyes, I'm just like, what am I watching right now? What is this? But they were hugely successful. This one on the left is called Lost in Thailand. It was the first big Chinese comedy that made, I think, $1 million over there, or something like that, or 1 million kwai. And the next one here is Journey to the West, and this is what I want to show the second clip of. So this is Journey to the West, Conquering the Demons. This is just as Chinese domestic comedies are starting to take off and really make their place in the industry and make a mark. And this is going to be a scene, it's close to the opening scene, and it kind of captures what I think most of the movie looks like. This is directed by Stephen Chow. So basically this guy on the left, he's like a demon catcher, and there's a demon that's a fish, but it's a person inside of a fish, and you'll see.
你再不放手，我就打死你！我发誓，我会真的把你活活打死，很残忍的。谢谢道长。不要！我来！
That's the most successful movie of 2013 in China. I went, as I was writing this, I went on a project to watch the biggest movie in China in every year from, I think, starting in 2012. And when I got to this, I was just like, what did I just watch? Like, how is that, it's, the production values aren't great, the CGI isn't great, the jokes are what they are, basically like fat jokes. And I came away from it just being totally baffled. And yet, it has traction over there. In some ways, it's normal for comedies that do well in one country to not do well in another. That's Hollywood saying comedy doesn't travel because, it's all based on the language and the innuendo and all that stuff. But I think in many ways, this is a snapshot of kind of where the industry was at the time. It's messy. It's just throwing a bunch of stuff together. It's based on, this is based on Journey to the West, like an ancient Chinese story, like a super famous myth. And so it resonates a little bit on that level, and then they're playing to the home crowd in some ways. So I found this stuff baffling, and to kind of figure out more of where it came from, I went on a reporting trip to the city of Hengdian. Hengdian is in Zhejiang province. It's what's often called the Hollywood of China. And it's where a lot of these types of movies are made, a lot of TV shows, all these sort of imperial dramas that you see, they're all based in Hengdian, or they're all filmed in Hengdian. And so I went there in 2017 and sort of bummed around the movie sets for a while and talked to people. It's a very, very, very weird town. So what it's kind of known for, what made it famous and successful in the movie industry was they said, okay, we want to be a movie attraction in some ways. They sort of stumbled into it by making sets. And what it came down to is there's a local billionaire who kind of owns like everything in the town. And when people wanted to make movies about sort of ancient Hong Kong, or they wanted to make a movie about ancient Beijing using the Forbidden City, he was like, okay, I'll build it. And he would just build full-scale replicas of ancient Chinese places. There's a full-scale Forbidden City. There's a full-scale sort of Qin Dynasty palace. There's all of these buildings that are built. They're not like sets in the traditional sense. They're real. Like they are the full buildings, and you can use them in the way that you use a building. And so, in his attempt to kind of build up the local film industry, he did it by just building all these sets. And I think it starts to get at part of what's driving the growth of the Chinese movie industry, that it really is just about putting these things together. Not necessarily about the abstract ideas. He's not the guy who built this town, he's not an artist. A lot of the people that come there are aspiring actors that kind of come here to Hollywood. So this guy on the left, he's playing an ancient emperor in, I think, one of the Han dynasties, who's scorned and he's kicked out of town or whatever. I talked to this guy, he's my age. He was working as a radio broadcaster and then kind of got into acting because he's a very handsome guy. He's got a nice, square jaw. And so in this, he's doing one of the many, many dramas that retread kind of the same ground again and again. If you spend time in China, you go into any like cheap restaurant, always on the TV screen is some emperor, some concubine, somebody like with super dramatic shots, and they just don't look that great oftentimes. They have very low production values, but they're a hit over there. This guy on the right, another extremely weird guy that I met over there. He goes by the name Ge. Ge like checker pattern, and Ge like older brother. Because he's famous because he goes into the middle of intersections all around Hengdian and sings live karaoke to like techno pop and just like sort of shuts down the city around him. So I walked around with him for a night while he just took to the streets. Here he's not wearing his checker cape, but he's another, he's like the people who come to Los Angeles looking to become a star. He came from Sichuan. He doesn't even speak like very good Mandarin, but he just goes out there and kind of shows out every day in hopes that he'll get discovered. The city's full of very strange things like that. I go into some more details in the book. But it's also a place where you're starting to see the industry come together, and some people who really do care about storytelling, artistry, who really are trying to kind of level up and bring the Chinese movie industry up to what we see over here, they're also there. This guy is one of the most interesting people I met there. He's a former ballet dancer turned actor. And I came onto the set as they were filming a movie called Wuzhe, it means fighter, but the English title is Shadows and Echoes. And it's a kung fu movie, but it's kind of about the period as kung fu is kind of losing ground to modern weapons and what happens to the old kung fu masters at the time. And I sat down with him for a very long time, and I was just super impressed by the thoughtfulness that goes into some of these movies. I just watched Journey to the West, Lost in Thailand, these just really weird, all over the place kitchen sink comedies that were doing well. But in talking to him and in watching them film, I started to get the sense like maybe there is something emerging out of here. Maybe when you do bring together enough film sets, enough people, enough money because you have a large domestic market, something might come out of that despite the controls. And I talked to him, I asked him about how he sees the relationship between Hollywood and China. He said, I'm not ashamed to say that I look to Hollywood. I'm not ashamed to say that I study Hollywood or even imitate Hollywood. But I think this is all part of a process. He says it's a process. When you're starting from nothing, you look to the good examples and you imitate them, and then you start branching off in your own directions. You start achieving your own sort of artistic goals. And as I was here at this time, I was watching in very, very much real time as the Chinese film industry was starting to do a piece of that. While I was here, it was the time that a movie called Wolf Warrior 2 was huge in China. It was the first kind of billion-dollar movie over there, and it's basically, like a lot of American movies from the 70s and 80s. American badass soldier goes into third world country, fights the bad guys, saves the poor people, and is a hero. And I went to see it the night that I talked to that guy because it was a total sensation over there. So I'm going to play a clip from that. In the clip, the lead actor Wu Jing, he's in sort of an unnamed African country where there is a revolution, civil war, and he's trying to sort of save the locals and save himself. And yeah, it's quite a film. I'll just cut right to it.
Chinese embassy， 去大使馆啊，他们会收留我们的，我们是中国人。
Hey, what about us? What are we supposed to do?
Will they accept us? Had to say, that's our country. Everybody, follow me.
Yeah, so apologies for not warning you that there's all that blood and guns flying around. But I walked into the movie theater and watched this, and it was fascinating on many levels. So on one level, you look at that and it's like, it's not quite on the visual level of true American blockbusters. It doesn't look as good as whatever, Avengers Endgame and stuff like that. But it looks a lot better than the Stephen Chow Journey to the West film, just from a visual level. The visual effects are better, the action is a lot better. And when I talked to Chinese filmmakers over there, including that guy, I asked them about Wolf Warrior, and they said, I thought they were going to be very dismissive. It's a patriotic action flick, whatever. I thought they were going to say, I'm in it for art. They all said, no, this is it's an inspiration. It's kind of showing us what Chinese films can be, the level that they can get to if they bring in the right production values. And it kind of did that by bringing together a few things. They're bringing a Hollywood style into a Chinese story. And I think it has a few elements. On the one hand, it's very much a Rambo First Blood Part 2 story. It's a classic story of whatever, badass superpower warrior goes to beat up on poor people and save the day. We have seen this movie. I love Sylvester Stallone, huge fan. But it's the storyline that we've seen. The second element that they brought in is they brought in the Russo brothers. These are the guys who directed big picture movies like Captain America, some of the Avengers movies, Endgame, Infinity War, and they are kind of like the action thriller gurus of Hollywood in some ways. And they were brought on as consultants for this movie, just to make it honestly look better, just to bring it up closer to the level of what an American movie looks like on a purely visual level. And then the last ingredient is patriotism, The American movies, Hollywood has fed off American patriotism for a very long time, whether it's Rocky IV, Rambo II, whatever. People like to go out and watch their own countrymen go beat up, blow up people in other countries. And when you brought these three ingredients together, it led to by far the biggest movie in Chinese history up to that point. So I want to make sure we have time to speak at the end. So I'm going to go through the rest of this a little bit quicker. We're going to play one more clip, and this is from The Wandering Earth. This is the big hit movie of this year. It's based on a story by Liu Cixin, who wrote The Three-Body Problem, a major science fiction writer. And I think this is where we see yet another leveling up in terms of production values and in terms of how much this looks and feels like it could be a Hollywood movie. So here, Netflix is good at protecting intellectual property, so I had to just give you the trailer instead of an actual clip from the movie.
从流浪地球计划启动的第一天起，就再也回不去了。
In the past 72 hours,
地球错失了最后一次机会。
受木星引力增强影响，地球将于37小时4分12秒后撞击木星。这是一场注定徒劳的救援。
mayday！气压降低500微是卫生生理，气压降低500微。
看来我们只能靠自己了。30年来，发动机从来没有熄过火。这不是简单的救援，我们摊上大事儿。
Warning: Earth engine system failing. Total 121 facilities. Correction 1,001. Correction 3,000. Correction. 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 Correction.
为了我们的孩子，我们已经没有什么不能失去的。这是要在军事法庭的，你疯了吗？怎么还等于同归于尽？是不能再死人了。地球上35亿人，我老婆孩子全他妈白死了。你可想好了？这是我们唯一回家的机会。快呀，快点！
我原来以为家在身后，现在才知道，家在前面。
千万要顶住！
去你妈的！无论最终结果将人类历史导向何处，我们决定选择希望。祝地球好运。
That's The Wandering Earth. That's sort of a snapshot of exactly where the big picture, the biggest Chinese blockbusters are today. We kind of look back over the movies that we've seen clips from and the story that we've gone through, maybe just a little bit of reflection, get into questions quickly. Whoops. This I'm going to get to in just one second, but first I just want to go back over the movies we watched. So we started with Farewell, My Concubine. In many ways, it's the earliest film we saw, and it's the most artistic in many ways. It's the most beautiful. It got the most sort of international acclaim from an artistic perspective. But it didn't have a whole lot of popular success because it wasn't allowed to have it at the time because of censorship controls. Fast forward into the age of the kitchen sink comedies and the co-productions. We've got the Stephen Chow Journey to the West, and they're working towards what we'd consider kind of a mainstream blockbuster, a mainstream comedy, but the production levels just kind of aren't quite there in a lot of ways. And in my mind, the storytelling isn't quite there, but who am I to judge? Wolf Warrior, another major turning point in this, where you finally start to see true Chinese blockbusters that look and feel like our blockbusters. They draw on American resources in some ways. They get the Russo brothers in for consulting, but they're doing it with Chinese stories. I think The Wandering Earth is really, it's another leveling up in this sort of continuous journey. It's based on really indigenously Chinese material. It's based on Chinese sci-fi. Which is one of the most interesting creative branches of Chinese art and culture these days. The film, I don't know about you, but when I watch it, I'm like, that's pretty much, that could be Armageddon or Gravity or whatever your big picture space drama is. And yeah, I think at this point, both of these movies, Wolf Warrior and Wandering Earth, they earned tons and tons of money within China, but they earned only a fraction, a very tiny fraction of their box office outside of China. They still haven't yet gotten mainstream traction over here. One of those movies that got the most traction over here was actually Farewell, My Concubine, way back in the day, at least within the artistic community. So I want to just basically throw out some ideas that I think are interesting questions that maybe we can discuss based on whatever you want to talk about in the question and answer. But this is what's always on my mind because I'm looking at Silicon Valley and I'm looking at Hollywood. The source and nature of creativity in the US and China. I think China's rise and relative success in these two industries, tech and film, challenges a lot of our ideas because they come at it a different way. I think in the US, we tend to think of creativity and of innovation as abstract properties, as something you can't really get your hands on. And the source of them, what they really require is certain kinds of freedoms, freedom of speech, a free internet in the case of innovation and technology. We think that that's really the crucial ingredient. And for so long, especially in tech, but also in Chinese film, there was a sense, they're not really going to make a truly great product unless they have these freedoms that we think are so central to Silicon Valley or to culture in Hollywood. I think that China has taken a very different tact and it has a different philosophy of what brings these things about. I think creativity and innovation are seen as emergent properties. And they're things that emerge fundamentally when you pile together a critical mass of tangible assets and resources. In the case of film, you have a large enough market, you have enough movie theaters, you have a middle class with enough money, you have the literal physical movie sets in Hengdian, you subsidize the cameras, you subsidize all this, throw it together, and eventually you're going to get a wolf warrior. You don't need freedom of speech to get that, is the idea. Same thing in technology. We don't need a free internet, we need 1 million computer science PhDs, we need a bunch of incubators where they can all found startup companies and run them, and we need some venture capital money. Throw these things together and eventually we'll get an Alibaba or a TikTok. And I think that it does fundamentally kind of challenge the way we think about these industries. There's still hurdles, there's still things that they haven't achieved, but I think it's a very interesting way to kind of turn our perception around a little bit. So I think of their recipe as 3 factors, 3 ingredients. A large semi-protected market that incentivizes people to come in and incentivizes your own people to invest. You need a critical mass of these tangible resources, and you need a certain amount of international know-how. In some ways they get that through co-productions. In technology they get it because a lot of Chinese students go to school or work here and then end up going back to China, or companies like Google open a research lab over there. And this recipe, it looks a lot more like traditional industrial policy than what we think of as creativity and innovation. This is how you build up like an export industry. This is how you build up a sake industry in some ways. And a lot of folks thought this wouldn't work when you applied it to these more creative and innovative industries, but I think it's a challenge to the way we think, and it's something at least to chew on for a while. So these are open questions. I don't want to take up any more time talking. I want to hear what you guys have to say. But I think the open question is, when will China create a truly global blockbuster, a wandering Earth that is as successful abroad as Avengers Endgame? And will this recipe continue to work if the restrictions continue to get tighter? I think one thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is maybe China even kind of overlearning its own lessons. They learned, you don't need a free internet, so they're now starting to even take away VPNs, which are what allow you to get to the free internet within China. I think that's a bit of overreach. In film, can you continue to make these movies if you continue to make more and more things off limits and to make it harder and harder for really creative people to just kind of like live and be happy there? So I don't have the answers to either of these two. I don't think anyone really does, but it's what I'm looking forward to following and learning about over the coming years. So thank you very much.